Can I thank you at the front for framing, I think, so wonderfully framing the whole question, I think, I mean, at least for me, and I hope for the debate, you know, that is it about prevalence, is it about statistics, is it about conviction rates, or is it really about the representation of women, but not always women, within our culture and sexual violence? And if I can just take the two questions, that the lady who spoke so eloquently, who's also teaching in a university, I'm not suggesting factually or didactically that 9-year-olds, your daughter or my mother, or should absolutely fear rape. What I'm saying is that all women, regardless of their age, are represented within culture in a certain way. So in fact, I'm speaking to both of the points. The whole question about rape and the reality of rape as we understand it in the culture, but also the way in which women are represented within culture. And if I can just take the point that was directed at me on the issue of consent, again, I was using consent provocatively to ask people to ask themselves, what is the nature of consent in your life, and how difficult must it be for consent to be interpreted within a courtroom scenario? So I was talking metaphorically, but can I just move on very quickly to a very important question and comment that was put from the lady at the front about how we should be raising our consciousnesses about taking this debate, whilst not saying it doesn't exist here, rape doesn't exist, nor the violent representation of women, the sexualized representation of women within the culture across all forms of media. The whole point that ISIS today and Syria today, these are absolutely real matters. I would say in response to what's happening to women in Syria today, that in fact it's happening to men, it's happening of course to the Shia, it's happening also to Sunni who disagree, it's happening to Christians, and that is rape, and that is mutilation of all kinds. But the important point I know that you raised when you mentioned Susan Brownmiller, and that Susan Brownmiller, who wrote Against Our Will in 1975, couldn't possibly imagine what's being faced today. I think what is significant, and I'll end on this before the red card comes up, and ending on this is to say that, you know, we had many rapes. Rape was used as an instrument of war, and we all know that. And it was used as an instrument of war in Serbia, in Rwanda, it's being used in Syria. But the important thing that we need to take away with is that it wasn't until 2000 that international criminal law recognized rape as a crime of humanity, because it didn't matter. And journalists in Syria said, how many more women do you want raped? Said this to the Western world. How many more women do you want raped? Do you want 10,000? Do you want 20,000? Before the international community recognises that rape was being used, but not just against women, against men as an instrument of war. And we have to ask ourselves why it took so long for us to recognise this with international law.
Thank you, Sue. Sorry, don't mean to cut you off. Caitlin.
Yeah, maybe just my point is to kind of reiterate the point that I made, that rape culture is not just about rape and sexual assault. I think living in a rape culture means that we live in this world where sexual harassment, street harassment, the general trivialization of rape, for example, through rape jokes, through these kind of like offensive, misogynistic content, web pages that exist, is very real. Now, you're right. Okay, once again, the point about there are women in other countries who are experiencing lots of horrors that women in the West don't experience, but that doesn't mean that these other practices don't have very real harmful consequences for women. There's lots of evidence in my own research, for example, that shows that, you know, I no longer walk a certain way to work because I know that I'm going to be harassed constantly. I no longer wear certain types of clothing because, once again, it brings certain type of attention that I don't like. So it has negative consequences. It has real consequences for women's lives. And I think to dismiss it and to say that rape culture isn't real, that it's not a problem on campus, is just, it's wrong and it's ignorant. And, you know, we can debate about the statistics, but it doesn't matter, I think, once again, if it's 1 in 50, 1 in 4. It is a problem, and it is something, I think, that all women know what it's like to live in a rape culture where sexual harassment is a problem, where they have a fear, where women are constantly aware that, yes, I might be raped at any point, and it won't necessarily, probably if you are raped, it's not going to be by the stranger in the street. It's going to be by someone that you know, someone that you trust, and probably in a space that you perhaps feel comfortable, your home, their home, a potentially safe space. So I'll finish there.
Just very quickly, I'm intrigued by that, because that seems to undermine the rape culture argument, doesn't it? That you're more likely to be raped by someone who's close to you, who will take advantage in an opportunistic setting, but yet all men are potentially triggered into rape by the interaction with culture. Is there a contradiction there or not?
Sorry, that men are triggered into rape by...
Well, the suggestion of the rape culture argument is that men are, raped because they interact with misogynistic culture. Well, at least that's the argument that's made. But that seems to be undermined by the suggestion that, and the truth, that rape is more likely to be committed by someone who's in an opportunistic setting, in an intimate setting. So do you see a contradiction there or not?
I don't think so. I mean, just if I understand your point correctly, anyone is capable of engaging in rape, and I don't think it's just misogynists who rape. Nice guys rape too, and this is the problem we have when we don't believe that Bill Cosby could be a rapist, that Jimmy Savile could be a rapist, because it's not just kind of blatant misogynist who everyone says he hates women, he's going to rape women. Any person, and I think part of it is entitlement. I think there are kind of these blurred lines about entitlement.
Yeah, great. Ian?
So just on the solutions thing, and I'm going to be fairly boring, actually, with the solution. I mean, I hate it whenever anyone says this, but it happens to be true in this case. It has to be education. And it's a very long-term thing, and actually that goes on both sides. So firstly, that is about, as you're alluding to, sort of, describing the ways, sort of trying to defeat victim blaming and explaining to women exactly where consent starts on the smallest and the largest matters. But it is also there, I think, I'm not as sanguine as some of my libertarian allies on the role of pornography in the formation of the teenage sexual mind. So I think for adults it needs to be protected, it is an expression of our fantasies. And yet, for when kids come to it, 14-year-old kids, 13-year-old boys, their first introduction to the sexual world is now through usually quite aggressive pornography. I don't think that they're in a position developmentally, to be able to see the distinction between fantasy and reality. And as long as we keep on dragging our heels on sexual education in school, which should be as broad as humanly possible, we are going to keep on finding these problems later on. I think that also goes, by the way, for telling women what it is like when you report rape. There is an idea that it is still as it was in the 1970s and 1980s. In fact, there's been a quite significant improvement in the way that police treat those situations. And it'd be nice if women had a clearer idea of how that would work, and that it doesn't have to be this utter horror story that they may imagine it could be. Education for adults, I think that stops by the time we get to 18. When we go into college, I've already said, I think that the consent classes are a problem. But there's something else there as well, which is as soon as, say, I don't know if you guys remember, about 5 years ago, Ken Clark very inelegantly sort of made this point around more serious rapes and less serious rapes in terms of how we would come up with charging. Now, he made it very inelegantly and unwisely. The point he was making was not unsound, and of course something that would be taken into consideration at the point of charge, that, if there was violence or if there was kidnapping or something, of course there's going to be a more severe sentence. But the response to him, this shouting of rape is rape and we close down the issue, actually I think serves to de-educate adults as to the discussion, so that women themselves who have suffered something that would happen on a one-night stand, the drunken, regrettable sex, actually would be less able to think of that was rape, because to them rape is this sort of unanalyzed space where it's the most severe examples. But I do want to put a note of caution on all of that I just said, which is that we are dealing with a crime which is very specific. And it is specific in the sense that it typically has no witnesses. And that is something that we are never going to get over in rape. That's why we find ourselves coming up with these suggestions of, should we flip the need to prove innocence and guilt in the case of these cases? Because usually speaking, everyone agrees that the sex took place. There was only two people in the room, one of whom is the defendant, the other person is the victim, and they both have different assessments of how that situation took place. And that, unfortunately, is something that it is very difficult for us to deal with in a court of law, and that is just a true thing where our adversarial system, which has an onus on innocence, actually finds it very hard to deal with these situations. It's impressive that we have the convictions up to the point where they are equivalent to burglary, actually. And actually, it's a kind of a problem that we are going to struggle to get past.
Great. Right, I'm going to come back out to the audience.
Could the panel agree that sex is sex, rape is rape, and when sex is rape, it's no longer sex? Because I think what's happened here, and I'm trying to explain to myself why young women at the cusp of going out into the world find it so appealing to take on board as an article of faith the idea that they are very, very likely to be raped. The only time I've ever been attacked in my life, I survived a campus, I've survived the streets of London, I was attacked by a bunch of girls who stole my bag. That's much more likely to happen to you. And I drew no conclusions from the fact that they were a bunch of black girls. I drew no conclusions from that. I didn't tell everybody else that they had to then be careful of a bunch of black girls. I didn't then report it. I didn't bother because my bag was empty. I was poor. So why is there such an appeal of this to young women? I just don't get it. And I think that Ian, you're completely wrong on sex education. These young women are the product of sex education as it currently is. They are arguing for the kind of sex education that you are saying isn't happening. It is happening. If you look at the kind of people that advocate modern style or kind of informed or sort of sexy sex education, this is exactly what they're talking about. Consent training. That's what they're talking about, introducing at the youngest possible age. So stop arguing for sex education because these people are the product of it.
Okay.
Thanks. I wanted to press you further on sex education as well, Ian, because your argument to me seems very peculiar. It appears to be almost contending that the reason why some boys become rapists as men had something to do with the inadequacies of sex education, which seems to me to be the most peculiar, strange account that you could give of why a rapist rapes. I don't think it had anything to do with the absence or presence of sex education. And I think to create some kind of generalised connection between rapists and boys and school in this way is very, very peculiar. On your point about pornography, my argument would be is that the most important thing that teenagers need to do, as much as possible, is have more to do with each other in reality. We need more teenage sex. We need teenagers really genuinely getting off with each other much more, making mistakes, fumbling, and having bad experiences, because then they would learn reality and they wouldn't be so confused about pornography. And I think it is perfectly plausible to argue that precisely the reason why so many boys are spending time looking at pornography more and more is because they aren't having enough sex with actual girls. Oh, and by the way, when it comes to rape, a very big issue here is the fact that a 17-year-old boy can be charged with statutory rape for having sex with a 15-year-old girl. So if you really want to do something about it, we should have a big discussion about the problem of the age of consent.
Just looking at the wider context of this, I'm going to pick up on a couple of panelists have used the word regularly, misogyny. There is no scientific evidence whatsoever that it's a completely mythical feminist term. There's misandry. That's the basis of all social systems. And the use of the term misogyny is itself misandry. So the whole concentration focus on rape really is a subset of all this. And if you look again more widely in terms of violence against women, I'm the author of 3 major review papers on intimate partner violence, domestic violence. And all the evidence converges showing that actually women are more likely to perpetrate domestic violence than are males. And in particular, there's a lot of recent research showing that if you look in a couple context, the preferred mode of aggression by women is actually physical violence, whereas in any context where a female will be the target, men, that is normal men, back away. So the whole wider context of feminist theory is completely up a gum tree.
Thanks. One of the ideas that's been raised again and again is this idea of men's, particularly young men's, sense of entitlement to women's bodies. I mean, personally, I find that to be completely a bizarre idea. As a young man growing up, the idea of feeling entitled to women's bodies, and I feel that's very much the case in the milieu that I've hung around with, which is very, very broad, from building sites to universities. I feel that, you know, the kind of dynamic of men having to, in fact, often prove themselves and having to sort of prove their worth inherently before becoming something that's, you know, worthy of interest for women is very much a trope in the popular culture, certainly as much as the idea of men having some kind of sense of entitlement. I recently went, and I feel that this is a kind of an idea which is expressed and in sort of young men are spoken about as if they are like this, and I wonder where this idea comes from, because it simply doesn't chime with my lived experience and the lived experience of the young men that I know. I recently went to, just very quickly,
yeah.
Sorry. I recently went to a school where they were actually conducting a consent, or not consent class, so kind of a gender education class, which was a feminist education class. And the boys were coming out, young boys, with incredibly even-handed, egalitarian ideas, and they simply... One of the teachers after essentially said, yeah, well, they'll come out with these ideas, but if you scratch the surface, they're really sexist underneath.
Okay, excuse my English is not my first language, but I do my best. I'm afraid that you're not facing structural or cultural aspects very much yet. Well, some of you are, but not all. I have a question especially for Ian. That's your name? Yeah. You refer to men who rape women as bastards. So how do these men you refer to as bastards become bastards? And what can we do about it? According to the statistics, also from the country where I come from, Finland, you have quite a lot of those bastards. And also, do not forget that rape is always an act of power, and it shouldn't be individualized or psychologized either. Also, some of you here, even feminists, seem to suggest that women are misusing the system, those sneaky women. Then again, a question, culturally speaking, what is it an outcome of if some women misuse the system by false accusations? I'd like to have an answer for that.
Hi, I wanted to come back on the student at the front who described her trip from the bedroom to the library. Basically, you seem to be synonymizing rape culture with the existence of rape, because you gave as evidence that, you know, we live in a rape culture, the existence of sexually menacing behaviour or of rape, you know, happening. Nobody's disputing that. The point is, for us to live in a rape culture, for a descriptor or a characterization to make sense, it has to be comparative. We have to know, if we live in a rape culture, what is a non-rape culture, or where is this non-rape culture? Because a lot of the time, the proponents of the theory seem to be casting rose-tinted spectacles either back to some golden age where women were in less danger, which never happened, or to some El Dorado location elsewhere where women are safer, which actually, for most of the world, is also dramatically not the case. So for there to be a problem with rape or for rape to exist is not up for dispute. It's whether or not we live in a characterizably rape culture as compared to time and space elsewhere, basically.
Yeah, in the interests of correcting misinformation, I feel duty-bound to say something about the conviction rate, which Susan mentioned a couple of times. The conviction rate is actually, for rape, is actually high. It's not the highest of all crimes. Murder's higher, but it's in the top end. It's far, far higher than burglary. It's not infinitely higher, but it's much, much higher than the rate for burglary, obviously because so many burglars aren't caught. And you just need to look at the work of Cheryl Thomas to see that really, Professor Cheryl Thomas, to see that really well evidenced. I don't doubt, and I'm sort of expanding on the point that was made earlier, I don't doubt that it might be the case that the conviction rate is the same as it was in the 70s. But of course, as was said, we have far fewer cases there. And we also have very different cases. So we have, stranger rape cases in the 70s. We've had a massive increase in acquaintance rape, date rape, for the reasons that people have talked about. So it's perhaps not surprising that the conviction rate, has stayed the same, because the cases brought now are so much more numerous, and they're also more difficult to prove for the reasons that have been outlined. So let's not start a panic about the conviction rate, which is high compared with other crimes.
I just wanted to ask, would you guys agree with the idea that because we kind of do live in a rape culture, I think, because every day I see, not just women, I see people's bodies being sexualised in TV, in media, in game content, anything. But I think what also worries me is when we talk about education as well, I think it's not education and consent that we need, it's education and humanity. I'm 15, I have been catcalled numerous times wearing clothes like I'm wearing now, and even if being blamed on what you're wearing was a thing, I just don't think that's quite right. So maybe what we actually need to do is teach people that people are people and we all have our own rights. So maybe if we taught our young men and women, not that they need consent, but that they need to listen to other people's wishes just because that is the right thing to do. Because we all have humanity, and when that humanity is taken away, it is a crime.
This is to Christina. It's really hard to collect figures for rape and sexual assault because victims don't usually come forwards because it's stressful, it's scary. There's lots of things that stop them coming forwards. But I can tell you that 21 people who are close to me have been raped. And these are people who are my age, these are people younger than me, these are people older than me, these are people who live all over London. These are girls, these are boys. And 100% of the girls I have asked have been sexually assaulted at some point in their life, be this groped by a stranger or anything considered more severe. So do not try and say that this is not a pandemic. This is a massive issue, and it is on a very large scale.
I think maybe the feeling that, or the reason why lots of more young people feel like they're being harassed or shamed and is that they're now interpreting behavior that didn't used to be interpreted interpreted as violent or insulting or degrading, they're interpreting it in that light now, and perhaps it's leading to a definition of occurrences and behaviour that used to be quite normal into something very serious and shameful. And perhaps that's why, we're hearing that all of these phenomena are on the rise.
Christina, you're a heroine, and I love you. Caitlin, really early on, you said that many or even most men don't feel entitled to women's bodies and their time. So surely what you're saying is that there's not a rape culture. Most men don't feel, that it's socially acceptable, and the problem is actually with Ian's bastards. And then finally, on rape jokes, I believe that they're funny because everybody knows it's wrong, and so it's outrageous and shocking to use it in a trivialised context.
I think there's been a shifting of ground on the part of Sue and Caitlin during this discussion. I'm a little bit confused. So I think you started off saying there's a sexualised culture, and the problem is this leads to a high prevalence of rape. You've then been challenged on the statistics and said, well, actually, maybe it's just the existence of rape that's a problem, but actually it's the sexualised culture that's the problem. So where does your beef actually lie?
Panel, you have 1 minute to make your point, and we're going to take it in the same order as we started. So, Ian, 1 minute.
Good. Well, first of all, I'm very glad that I've coined the term Ian's Bastards. I'm going to take that home.
It's quite a good band name, I thought.
Yeah. All my memoirs. Yeah. Okay, so I mean, look, just to address this education thing, I think, because I got asked it directly. I think that if you're going to adopt a libertarian position for adults, you need to take a quite authoritarian position with children, so they can be developmentally at the stage where they can make informed choices without the interference of the state or anybody else later on. In the question of rape, this is particularly important, not just because victim blaming, by the way, victim blaming isn't just a thing with rape. I mean, we do it all the time across the range of human behaviours. It's much easier to blame the person who is the victim because they're typically speaking the weaker party and we get to side with the strong, and that's a very tempting psychological response, particularly pernicious in rape. Because very often it's in a friendship group where one person in the friendship group is being blamed, or it's an ex-boyfriend or a boyfriend where the friends are going to turn against the person because they don't want to think ill of him. On the pornography issue, I mean, the causal relationship between pornography and sexual assault is, if anything, in a very minor way, negative. It seems that where you introduce it, there may be a very small decrease in sexual assaults. However, we are in a situation where, for the first time, young people are being introduced to an extraordinarily varied and prolific amount of quite aggressive pornography at a very young age. And I think it would be foolish of us not to think that it's very important that they get some consent training or some appreciation that what they're seeing is fantasy rather than reality.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Caitlin.
Okay, maybe to address the specific point of has my ground changed? No, it hasn't. I think my overall argument is that rape culture doesn't necessarily mean that everyone who catcalls, everyone who engages in sexual harassment, everyone who tells a rape joke is going to go out and rape someone. Okay, so I think that those are two different incidences. Living in a rape culture means rape and sexual assault happens, but it's about this wider range of practice, which I think we need to recognize, and we are increasingly recognized as harmful. And that brings me to another point. A speaker at the back mentioned about how it's this reframing of everyday practices which were quite normal. You know, even up until a few years ago, you know, street harassment wasn't considered a problem. It was, you know, it was just something women accepted, and women perhaps didn't even have this word for it. Just like sexual harassment until the 1970s, you know, this sort of behavior was common, but there wasn't a word to describe it. There wasn't kind of a way of understanding the way that it's problematic. About rape jokes, I think that there are different types of rape jokes. You're right, humor can be used as a really great way to talk about, deal with some really horrible things that happen in life. But I think there's a difference between, hey, everybody, let's gang rape this woman here, and, you know, differences making a joke about the absurdity of the fact that we live in a world where rape happens.
Great, thank you. Sue?
Right. 1 minute. Thank you very much to the 15-year-old woman or girl or adolescent, depending on where the law puts you. But thank you. You have given us a clarion call to humanity, which is really what we should be doing when we say what is to be done, and it's about dignity and worth of each and every individual. So thank you very much for that. my major point here is not so much arguing about the conviction rate, but I would like to speak to the various people who've talked about the conviction rate, whether it's higher or lower, and how much of the conviction rate actually includes those who plead guilty, which means that the conviction rate is very deceptive, because we think it's about those who've actually been found guilty by jurors. We could talk about that, but my main point is about sexual scripts within society and the representation of women within society. As to the numbers, how many more, less, if we look at the murder statistics, 20%, nearly 20% of all women who are killed, these are female partners, let me rephrase that, 20% of the whole murder rate involves women who are killed by male partners. Every woman counts, every woman counts, every woman victim counts. In fact, every male victim counts as well. So I want to make that clear. So my point is really, what are we to do? And I go back to the 15-year-old, thank you. And I think we should take much more moral responsibility. We should complain about adverts. We should be on the red carpet, not just about suffragette, but every film that depicts women and men in a sexualized way that is derogatory, that debases them, that humiliates them, that harms them. That's what we should be doing here. We should be taking to the streets. We should be involved in direct confrontational action. And we're not. There's a kind of apathy. I don't agree that pornography is fantasy. Okay. Pornography is real, and red card is coming up. So pornography, and I don't agree that it doesn't have very much of an impact. It has a very significant impact. And if we do anything today, we should go out and challenge all those sexually violent, harmful, hurtful representations which do feed into what we do. Why is it that the advertising industry spends billions of pounds of dollars on adverts if what you see doesn't affect what you do?
Great, thanks, Sue.
Thank you.
Just a quick point of fact, the jury conviction rate being the percentage of cases where juries retire and consider their verdicts is also very high. So they convict in more cases than they acquit, which is something that most people don't know. But Christina.
Well, as a result of this panel, I'm now beginning to think that another word for rape culture is actually a free culture. And they are defining everything that can happen in a free society. Yes, people will tell off-color jokes. People will sexualize bodies. There will be sexiness. There will be, all sorts of comments in the street. Now, if you are in a society that's highly puritanical or authoritarian, they can control these things. But in a free society, it happens. And some people object to it and others don't. People are various. Women are not a monolithic group, nor are men. And you have to acknowledge that. And this, to me, is a kind of totalitarian worldview where we have this conspiracy theory and everything is feeding into women's subordinate status as victims of a rape culture. This is madness. It's madness. It is. Now, having said that, I'm going to take a different tone and go back to my original. Before I was bickering with feminists, I was a professor of ethics and philosophy, and I strongly believe in not sex education, yes, but more moral education in the home. You do have to raise your children to be considerate, loving human beings, and to respect other people. That's foundational, and without that, we're all lost. And we see, young men that are insufficiently socialized, that are raised without father figures, puts it at greater risk. And again, I think if we had a more serious discussion, not a fantasy discussion about a world, a rape culture that doesn't exist, but the real world, we would be talking more about stabilizing families, about educating children to be ethical human beings, and sort of straightforward approach to life. But we're not there now. We've been taken to a fantasy land, and I hope we come back to reality soon. Thank you.
Can we thank our panel?